remember those platonic dice I showed you a while ago? My homemade set of polyhedral dice, as the ancient Greeks would have had them if they had polyhedral dice, which they might actually have had, kind of. Anyway, I was recently prompted to have another look at the historical accuracy of those. See, when I made those, I actually didn't look too deep into the ancient Greek numeral system, because I thought I already knew it. Turns out it's a little more complex than I thought it was. Here's the thing though, there are actual archaeological findings of ancient Greek, well, Ptolemaic, but you get the idea, D20s that are inscribed with the Greek letters, but not with the numerals. Meaning my dice may not display the actual numerals, but they are laid out the same way actual historical polyhedral dice were laid out. So basically, I'm not sure where to go from here. Part of me wants to make another set using the actual proper numerals, but that's a lot of effort and time for something that would actually be less historical than what I already have. So I might do that in the future, at some point. Hello there, I'm Simon, welcome to my channel. Today is another episode of PC, playable characters from pop culture. I'll workshop that title. Anyway, this is where I pick a character from pop culture, like Percy Jackson, Avatar, Marvel, Disney, etc. And I try to turn them into a playable character for Dungeons & Dragons, because Dungeons & Dragons allows for that to happen, and it's fun to do. So why not? Anyway, today I'm doing the first request. On my first episode of this series, I made Percy Jackson, and I got a comment asking me to make Charles Beckendorf. So that's what we're doing today. So who is Charles Beckendorf? Well, he's a damn hero. Beckendorf is a son of Hephaestus, god of blacksmithing and crafting and stuff. As such, he was a leading member of the Hephaestus cabin, and he sadly did not survive the latest war against the Titans. That's all I'm gonna say about that. Read the damn books. So how are we gonna make this guy in Dungeons & Dragons? Well, the first question, as always, is what race do we make him? Now, Beckendorf is African American, but of course, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is D&D races. And if this is your first episode, you're probably expecting me to make him a human, because he is a human. But we're not gonna do that, because about 90% of all characters in fiction is human. And humans in D&D terms aren't very interesting. They are quite literally wildcards, in that you can use them for anything. So instead, I'm gonna look at some other features and see if I can map that onto a more interesting race. And in this case, that race is gonna be half-orc, because Beckendorf is described as a tall and a buff guy. So I feel like half-orc is the best suited to mimic that in a mechanical way. It also means that the African American guy is now a half-orc, which is kind of fitting, because both orcs and people of African descent are unjustly seen as inferior, dumb and aggressive, simply because they are the race that they are. So there's a parallel there. Hashtag Black Lives Matter. So what class do we make him? This is a very simple choice to make, because Beckendorf is a son of Hephaestus, god of smithing and crafting. So it wouldn't make any sense at all to make this guy anything but an artificer. An artificer is literally a magical inventor, which is basically what the Hephaestus cabin does. So artificer is pretty much the only option here. Also, Hephaestus kids don't usually get any supernatural powers, like a Poseidon kid would get water bending. I mean, Leo does, but he's an exception. Most of them are just really good engineers and good warriors, which means I don't need to worry about giving him a level of sorcerer to account for that. Of course, he still gets spells anyway, but we'll get to that. Now, Beckendorf has been at camp for a while, and he's the Hephaestus Cabin counselor, so it made sense to me to make him a level 5 artificer. As far as proficiencies go, I decided to give him proficiency in history, because he's been at camp for a while, so he'd know a lot about the things he might be up against, and sleight of hand, because that's a skill that I associate with crafting. I also had to choose a tool set to be proficient in, and while there were plenty of crafty tools, there was also something called smith's tools. So since that's what his dad is the god of, that's what he's proficient with. Now, an artificer can infuse items with magic, making them more magical and more powerful. But you have to pick some specific processes your character can learn to infuse items. So since Beckendorf is basically the leading smith at a camp for Greek demigods, I think he would focus that infusing on weapons and armor, and ways to make those better. I was able to pick 4 of these processes for Beckendorf. So I picked Armor of Magical Strength and Enhanced Weapon, for obvious reasons, and Returning Weapon, which is pretty self-explanatory. For the 4th, I picked Homunculus Servant, which is basically a kind of robotic assistant. I would be surprised if Beckendorf hadn't at some point made one of those. Of course, I also had to pick a specialty for him, a subclass. For Beckendorf, I figured the most fitting would be a battlesmith, which combines combat with engineering. It's a very military specialty, which I feel makes sense for a demigod, and it would have been very useful in the Battle of Manhattan. I also got to give him another toolset to be proficient in, so I decided that would be the carpenter's tools, because his dad is also the god of crafting. And I got to pick 2 ability scores to give a little boost, so that ended up being Wisdom and Charisma, because that seemed to fit the Charles Beckendorf that I know from the books. Now, as I said, Hephaestus kids don't normally get any extra powers on top of engineering, so Beckendorf doesn't actually need spells. But as an artificer, he does get some anyway, and I did find some that seem to fit him pretty well, because they have to do with different aspects of Hephaestus. So Hephaestus is the god of blacksmithing and crafting and stuff, but also of fire. And he's a Greek god, so anything combative could be useful. So I found the spells that worked with that, and that seemed acceptable for an experienced Hephaestus kid to be able to do. Also because a bunch of those could be used as a stand-in for the divine forging stuff Hephaestians might do. So I ended up going with Create Bonfire. I am aware that Beckendorf didn't have firebending, but I think he might just pray to his dad or use his craft to make a bonfire or something. Mending, because of course. Heroism, which I guess is kind of like bardic inspiration. Smithic inspiration. That one is one you get for free, so it's just there. Shield and Branding Smite for the trained demigod. Continual Flame and Heat Metal, because even though he's not a firebender like Leo, I still think he'd have some limited power over fire, or at least some expertise. And Warding Bond, which is kind of like heroism. It doesn't really fit Beckendorf, but it's there for free, and I can see ways to make it work. But possibly the most important part of making a character is assigning the stats. So for a Hephaestian, like Beckendorf, crafting stuff is important. So I felt that dexterity and intelligence would have to be high in order to be able to engineer and build all of these contraptions. So I made those 2 the highest. He's also known as a buff and tall guy, so I figured I probably shouldn't make strength and constitution too low. So those 2 are in the middle. They already get a boost from his race anyway, so we don't need to over-account for that. And finally, wisdom and charisma. Mostly because as a Hephaestian, he'd be more comfortable around machines and just not so great with people, I guess. At least that's my reasoning. I might be going off of Leo a little too much here. Which brings us to the description. Now, for a regular character, I would advise to fill in as much of this as you can. Or at least enough so you actually know who your character is. So your character becomes an actual person, rather than just a concept in your head. Even with NPCs, I would recommend filling in all of this, because you never know what information your players will ask for. However, for these pop culture characters, I usually leave most of this open. Because first of all, that stuff is down to the individual player, and I myself don't actually plan to play any of these. So I just leave it open for those who do want to do that. The second reason is that most of that is established in canon, so it's not like I have any freedom with that. And anyone who's gonna play this character probably already knows what they're all about. Which is why I usually stick to the bare necessities for these pop culture characters, which is the background. And for Beckendorf, I felt like folk hero would be the most fitting, because, well, he's a folk hero. That also meant that I got to pick another toolset for him, which were the jeweler's tools. It is fitting that a son of Hephaestus would be proficient with so many tools. Last but not least, let's have a quick look at his equipment. Again, I took into account his parentage. The fact that Hephaestus is his father means that he'd be focusing on the engineering part, and that he might end up using a hammer as a weapon. But it also means that he could, and would, totally make his own weapons and armor, and that he would make them a little extra, as in extra good and extra powerful, but also a little extra functional. So apart from the regular questing gear, I also gave Beckendorf a special poison dagger, which I imagine to be coated with some poison that is specific to the monsters from Tartarus. I also gave him some blasting powder, so explosives. What could possibly go wrong? It felt like he needed it though. Same with the hunting trap. Just to make sure he also has some ranged weapons, I also gave him a light crossbow, though I imagine the mechanics, by which I don't mean the game mechanics this time, but the actual mechanics of the crossbow, might be a little more complex than a regular one. Anyway, it seems likely to me that Beckendorf would have made himself special night goggles as well, so I went ahead and added them. And finally, I gave him a slightly more effective breastplate and a short sword, and an arrow-catching shield. Now, I might have gone a little overboard with the magical items, but he's the head of the Hephaestus cabin, so it kind of feels right. And he's a cinnamon bun, and I want him to stay safe. But to be honest, if I was DMing this character, I'd probably ask to replace like the dagger, the swords and the breastplate with their regular equivalents, for now. But that will do for this episode. Let's do the YouTube thing. You know the drill, and if you don't, everything is summed up in the end screen. If you don't know what to comment, what about this? What do you think of my interpretation? Is there anything you would have done differently? Anything I forgot to include? And what other characters would you like to see me make? And what should I call this series? Because the title I have now works, but I'm sure we can find something better. So any suggestions are welcome. Let me know all that down below. But I'm out of time for now. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.